Hey guys, it's Danny. Welcome to another episode from our Orchid Care for Beginners series. Today, I have quite the subject for you. We're gonna talk about light. It is not an easy subject. It is quite complicated, but I'm gonna do my best to make this discussion as friendly as possible. But unlike other topics in the series, it is indeed a little bit more complicated, and it's actually now one of those topics that has a rule that you need to follow, and if you follow it, everything will be okay. It's more of each individual case, a type of a thing. But if we always refer to what things actually do and how our orchids work, everything actually makes sense. So, are you providing enough light for your orchid? Is it too little or too much? Well, that's what I'm gonna try to help you determine today. Today's video, together with our entire Orchid Care for Beginners series, is sponsored by rePotme.com, who offers you everything you could possibly need to properly take care of your orchid, from potting mixes to fertilizers, accessories, and much, much more. If you're into bonsais, African violets, or succulents, they do have something for you as well, so I'll be sure to link you to their website down below in the description, and I will also link you to my personal favorite products that I've already been using for years at this point, and I really like them, even before I knew about rePotme. And before we start, don't forget to give this video a like. It lets me know that I'm doing a good job for you. A share would be great, and why not subscribe? I post 3 times a week. Right, so let's just start with talking about why light is important for orchids and what it actually does, because that will explain the signs we should look out for when determining if we're giving enough light to our orchid. Basically, light makes photosynthesis possible. Through photosynthesis, orchids produce their own food, which supports growth. Without this food, which is actually sugar compounds, orchids would not be able to grow leaves, roots, flowers, anything. Now, the processes are a little bit more complicated, so I'll be sure to link you an article that explains photosynthesis a little bit more down below in the description. But basically, when we're wondering if our orchid receives enough light, we are actually wondering if the orchid has enough food or enough energy to grow normally. Hence why I think it's a much better idea to focus on this aspect when it comes to determining if your orchid is receiving too little light. And yes, I know you'll find articles or other growers telling you that if your orchid does not receive enough light, it will have darker leaves, and if it's receiving too much light, it's vice versa. It will have too light leaves. And well, sadly, that rule only applies to about 10% of cases or 10% of orchids. And for me as a beginner many years ago, it was very confusing. So I will touch base with that, but I will not focus on that sign because in my opinion, it just doesn't apply for the vast majority of you. And furthermore, it will just create confusion. So let's refer to the things that will help you put your puzzle together rather than just some random rules that may or may not apply. The first sign that will tell you may not be providing enough light is the fact that your orchid grows very slow. And yes, generally speaking, orchids grow very slow in comparison to other plants, but when they don't receive sufficient light, they will grow even slower. And it makes sense. If light directly determines the quantity of food or sugars produced by the orchid, it will definitely determine the growth rate as well. For example, a healthy Phalaenopsis can produce 2, 3, even 4 leaves per year, depending on its size. Very big Phalaenopsis will not create as many leaves, but mini Phalaenopsis can actually create 3 leaves per year easily. When we are not providing enough light, a Phalaenopsis may create only 1 leaf per year, or maybe even half a leaf, quotation marks. What I mean is, leaves don't even get to mature within a growing season. That is definitely a warning sign that you should take into account and try to figure out what is wrong with your orchid. Growth rate should not be so slow. If you know that your orchid has an adequate root system and you are providing an adequate pot, an adequate medium, ventilation, and all of that stuff, fertilizer included, and still your orchid grows much slower than you read about on the internet, then maybe consider light. I know it's more of an obscure cause, but it actually happens a lot. Because Phalaenopsis are advertised as low light growers, but this doesn't mean that they don't need light at all. So many people place these orchids in very dark or shady locations in their home. and as a result, they will have excruciatingly slow growth. So even with low light orchids, make sure they do receive, if not filtered sunlight, then at least bright shade or artificial light, which we'll get to towards the end of this video, don't worry. So first sign, slow growth. It is a silent culprit that I think you should take into account. The next sign, which goes absolutely hand in hand with slow growth, is fewer structures grown per year. It is pretty obvious in the case of leaves. If you don't have speed, you don't have enough leaves per year. But it can also refer to the root system. And again, it makes sense. If the orchid does not have enough energy to support all of these structures, which absolutely need energy to grow, then obviously their numbers will be lower as well. And again, this is a more obscure, let's say, effect. You cannot really gauge how many roots your orchid should have, especially at the beginning. But again, in the case of Phalaenopsis, it is not uncommon for these orchids to absolutely take over the pot within a year or so. You should definitely see roots on the sides of your pot. If not everywhere, then definitely you should see about 50 to 60% of the space around the pot occupied by roots. This applies both to mini Phalaenopsis as well as to larger sized phals, because both of them do have pretty thick roots and they create a lot of roots. So if you've just repotted the orchid like this one is, take a look back into the pot 1 year from now. If the situation is very similar to the beginning, something is wrong. The orchid might look pretty healthy up top, but if you're lacking root system, I would suggest you consider light. Again, considering you've done everything else properly. Another sign would be the production of smaller and smaller structures. Now, this will happen very, very gradually and in time. Have you ever seen a Phalaenopsis that arrived to you with pretty large leaves, suddenly creating smaller and smaller leaves? Well, that can actually be a sign of too little light. Although I will have to admit, the vast majority of cases actually refer to the quantity of roots, to dehydration, which is a much more common cause. Also, if you've never fertilized your orchid, again, that is the cause of the smaller structures. But again, if you've done everything right, you watered correctly, your orchid does have roots, you are fertilizing regularly, and still your orchid is producing tinier and tinier leaves, then light quantity is the next culprit you should be looking at. Again, it makes sense. The less energy you have, the poorer looking the structures will be as well. So in the case of Phalaenopsis, obviously we're referring to leaves, but if you have a sympodial orchid such as an Oncidium or a Cattleya, then this can appear as smaller and smaller structures. Again though, light might be at the bottom of the list when you're considering culprits. First, look at the root system. Most cases, it's a dehydration issue caused by lack of roots or inadequate watering. But if you've eliminated everything, then definitely look at the light quantity as well. And lastly, of course, no blooms or very, very little blooms. In my experience, it is actually more common for orchids which don't receive enough light to not bloom at all, rather than having a poor blooming. Typically, when we don't fertilize enough or when the orchid does not receive enough hydration, but it is receiving enough light, it will actually put on flowers, but the show will not be great. When it comes to too little light, actually orchids just refuse to bloom, and some orchids are very adamant about it. Vanda orchids typically will not bloom if they don't receive enough light because they are highlight orchids, but in my experience, Phalaenopsis orchids will refuse to bloom if they don't receive enough light as well. And I actually did a test on purpose. I grew some Phalaenopsis in very, very low light, and even though they looked pretty good, none of them actually bloomed that season, even with the drop in temperature. As you know, I grow all of my orchids in the same room and they receive pretty much the same conditions. Everybody who received enough light bloomed beautifully. These guys did not. And the only parameter that I changed was light. So I can say 100% that light quantity affects blooming, and specifically if the orchid will bloom or not. So again, through the process of elimination, if you know you did provide adequate care and culture for your particular orchid and still it does not want to bloom, definitely check the light. For some species of orchids, it is the determining factor when it comes to blooming, while for others, it might be a secondary factor, but definitely not one you should overlook. Now, before we start talking about too much light, let's address a little bit the situation of leaf coloration depending on light. Yes, in some cases, the leaves will actually be a little bit darker if they receive too little light. But actually, some orchids will respond in the same way if they're receiving too much light, because they will try to produce a pigment which protects them from light. And this pigment is called anthocyanin, and depending on the orchid, it can look slightly purple or even red. And I do have quite a few examples to show you. So if we have a pretty varied collection, and I'm not saying a lot of different orchids, maybe a lot of Phalaenopsis, because they can be different between them as well. So if we do have quite a few orchids, we might actually get mixed signals. Some of them might actually respond with lighter leaves instead of dark leaves when it comes to the quantity of light, while others grown in the same conditions might respond with dark leaves. So you're gonna get a bunch of very mixed signals. I would definitely not take that rule into account, or just that rule, and rather think about the big picture. So now let's talk about signs of too much light, because here is where leaf coloration comes more into play. If an orchid is receiving too much light, in many cases, it will respond with a coloration change. And in most cases, you will see the appearance of a reddish or purple hue on the leaves. Now, this is an example that I actually had recently. This orchid has been exposed before me purchasing it to very high amounts of light. And as you can see in the footage on the screen, it was almost purple. And now, receiving adequate light, you can see the coloration completely changed to a rather darker green. As I was saying, the reddish pigment is called anthocyanin, and I will link you to an article which talks more about it down below. Basically, this pigment, amongst other things, has a role in protecting leaves from intense light. So obviously, when orchids experience intense amounts of light, they will try to protect their leaves so that they don't get burned. We're gonna get to that, don't worry. However, not all orchids will respond in the same way. And here I have an example of two Phalaenopsis orchids. But I think it's really obvious to see that the coloration on their leaves is really not similar at all. In the case of this orchid, which is the Phalaenopsis bellina, no matter how intense the light, you will never see purple leaves. It is not prone to produce high amounts of anthocyanin. It only produces a little bit for the flower, but when it comes to the leaves, it just doesn't do that. This orchid, on the other hand, in very intense light, will respond with paler leaves. They're not going to be much paler than what you see here, but they won't be this vibrant green. So you can see how that rule can be very misleading, because if you have these two orchids in the same amount of light, let's say intense light, you might notice that one appears to darken up while the other appears to lighten up. So in this case, it is just about knowing what orchid you have, and all you have to do is Google it. If you're not gonna find written the way it behaves in intense light, then just look at the pictures. Look and see how the vast majority of them look like. Just gauge the coloration of the leaf that you see there to the one that you have at home, and try to figure out if it is the type of orchid which will get red or the type of orchid which will lighten up in intense light. What you want to have is a sort of a medium type of green, and obviously if your orchid is just growing like no one's business and it's blooming, there's no reason for you to wonder if you're providing enough light. But just so you know, orchids do respond with some coloration change on their leaves, but it just might differ wildly depending on the variety or species. Next sign which indicates too much light is sunburn, and I'm going to keep this orchid because it actually has sunburn. So you remember the footage that I showed you earlier where this orchid was completely red? Well, the most red parts actually turned out to be burned spots. Each orchid will respond a little bit differently. This particular one got super red before it got burned, but some orchids will just go directly to burns. Now, this is a bit of an indirect sign because the burns are created by the temperature of the leaf. The tissue gets so overheated that it just collapses, it dies off. And typically, overheating happens in intense light. And what you have to do is try to shelter the orchid from direct sunshine. You can use sheer curtains, or you can just change the location of your orchid to a shadier location. Orchids still need to photosynthesize, they need light, just not so intense that it actually burns them. It's easy to determine if your orchid will get burned. Throughout the day, try to touch the leaves from time to time and see if they get hot. If they're cool or just slightly warm, that's typically okay. What you don't want to feel is heat, proper heat. So best thing to do is not to let the leaves get to that temperature by providing a little bit of shade. Mind you, just because the foliage of your orchid is red doesn't actually mean you should reduce the light quantity. For example, cattleyas, which are highlight orchids, they are very prone to having either purple freckles, either a reddish tinge to their leaves. That is not a sign you're providing too much light, but rather adequate light. And again, it has to do with just researching what type of orchid you have. Some orchids are highlight orchids, and they will actually appreciate the higher intensity and they won't get burned as easily as others. So the purple pigment is definitely not bad, but you have to put it in the context of your orchid and of your environment. Now let's talk a little bit about artificial light, which is absolutely great for orchids in case we don't have any space that receives adequate light for them. Most orchids actually respond super well to artificial light. In fact, at the moment, most of my orchids are grown under artificial light because I just don't have enough well-lit spaces in my grow room. So adding some artificial light can be a great booster for your orchid. But the topic of artificial light is quite bushy, and I would prefer to dedicate a separate video to it in which I will talk more about what types of lights to choose, how to position your orchids under the lights, and some best practices that I myself have discovered along the years. Basically, the signs of too little light and too much light apply with artificial light as well. But with artificial light, indeed, there is less of a chance for you to burn your orchid, especially with the brand new lights available on the market, which are LEDs. These lights don't tend to become very hot, and unless the leaves are directly touching the bulbs, it is highly unlikely for you to have actual burns on the leaves. If there is a little bit of a distance between the orchid and the light, everything should be fine. But indeed, be on the lookout for signs of too much or too little light. And of course, stay tuned for another episode for beginners regarding artificial light, since recently rePotme introduced their very own grow lights. And that's great timing because, as I told you a few months ago, I do intend to switch all of the lights in my grow room to actual grow lights, since I do believe there is a difference, and that difference is worth it. For now though, we're just going to stick to natural light or basic artificial light. Alrighty guys, so that is about it on light. Did I tell you it's a pretty bushy subject? I just hope that I gave you some ideas at least to research and learn more about. If you didn't know about these terms, I'll be sure to include as much information as possible down below in the description. As always, feel free to go and research on your own. Bottom line, light is very important for orchids. The best source of light is of course natural light, but not all of us have a good exposure. We don't all have very bright houses. Well, orchids generally grow tremendously well under artificial light, and generally speaking, they don't do well in very dark places. So hopefully now you know what you're looking for, and when it comes to artificial light on my channel, you're gonna see a lot more videos on the subject and more future videos, as I am kind of switching from kitchen lights that I've been using for the past 4 years to more advanced type of light. So stay tuned for that. But for today, that's about it. Hope you guys enjoyed this subject and you got to know your orchid just a little bit better. Thank you rePotme for sponsoring yet another video, and thank you guys for offering me your time. Subscribe to my channel for more orchid videos, tutorials, experiments, updates, and other fun orchid subjects. If you wish to support the channel, do consider becoming a member or visit the merch store linked down below in the description. You can also follow me on Instagram and Facebook. It's always nice to stay in touch there as well. And with that said, I'll see you next time. Bye!